Okay, well, we'll just go ahead and proceed on as we were planning on doing. We have several on Zoom now, so so that's good. All right. Now, if you recall last week, we were continuing our study of the literal interpretation of scripture and how the premillennialists, as a general rule, want to make all prophecy literal, and the other side of that, which is more of our viewpoint, is that you can't make everything literal. It won't work. It doesn't fit with scripture. But at the same time, you don't want to make everything figurative, because there is literal verses among the prophecies that were literally fulfilled, as we talked about last week, of Jesus being born in Bethlehem and being nailed to a cross and things like that. So hands pierced and that sort of thing. So the question was asked last week, which one would naturally ask. And the question is this: why did God use figurative language at all? Why didn't he just say what he meant, mean what he said, and be done with it? It would make things so much simpler than having to divide out and figure out and deal with it. And there's an answer for that. We don't know. We don't know. Now, there are basically three possible, well, there's at least three possibilities. There may be more. But the first possibility is, as was pointed out last week, that God could be talking in figurative language in order to hide different things from Satan, from the way he's going to do things in the future, and the way he presents it in scripture through prophecy. You wouldn't necessarily come to that immediate conclusion, and therefore it may have kept Satan from being quite as active and as involved as he might have been. That's one possibility. A second possibility kind of dovetails with that, but specifically looking at the book of Revelation, you've got 7 letters going to 7 churches, which then, of course, went to a multitude of other churches after that. And at the time that Revelation was written, the Roman government was in charge, and the Roman army had the possibility of stopping any courier that they saw and requesting to see what it was they were carrying in terms of the mail, because you didn't have the postal service. You had people carrying letters and scrolls and things like that from place to place to place. So the Roman government could stop you and make you and read whatever you were carrying. And if they didn't like what they were carrying, they could either kill the messenger and or just destroy the letter. So if you think about Revelation and consider the real possibility or reality that the book is primarily focused on the downfall of Rome, it would not serve much purpose to make that real clear to the Roman soldiers that are going to be reading it and destroying it, because it's talking about the downfall of the Roman Empire. So God would then put it into figurative language that would be understood by the Jewish community specifically, because in most congregations there were Jews who had become Christians. When they heard it, they would not only understand it from their point of view, but they could also explain it to the Gentile members that might not be as familiar with the terms and phrases. For example, it says that in Revelation that the Lamb was, the throne had on it a slain lamb. Well, taking it absolute strict under face value, that sounds like a bloody mess. Bleeding lambs on thrones don't make much sense. However, of course, if you're from a Jewish background, you hear the same thing, and you know the Lamb being representative of the Messiah, and then being slain, that's the cross, and being on the throne is the kingship of Christ. So they would hear the same words and come to a totally different conclusion than someone who was not educated in the Jewish mindset. Now there is the argument against that says, well, all they had to do was sit in church for a little while and they could figure it out because they would they'd get the code. If you want to think of it as a code, they would understand the code. But we're not really thinking about long term here, we're talking about short term, as in they're just out on the road stopping people with messages, and they stopped this guy and he's carrying a letter to the church at Thyatira, and he starts to read it. Doesn't make any sense, doesn't seem like it's anything to worry about, so he simply gives it back to him and lets him go on his way. That's a possibility. So there are two possibilities. Now, the third possibility is also in vogue here, and that would be that the prophecies were written for the people of the day and used terminology that was familiar to the people of the day, and language was used similar to the way we use language today. You've got various and sundry aspects of speech that are used by us today when we talk about anything, not anything spiritual or religious, just conversation. And
kind of like horseshoes and hand grenades. If you don't know what a hand grenade is,
right,
it doesn't make any sense to you.
It makes no sense at all. Well, for example, where you will read in any literature that you want to pick up about the sunrise, okay, and the sunset. Now, we have two congregations in Lubbock named Sunrise and Sunset, but that's not necessarily what we refer to when we talk about sunrise and sunset. But you talk about the sunrise and sunset. Now, question, does the sun actually rise or does the sun actually set? Of course not. We know that. Now, in prior times, decades earlier, they may not have known that. But we know it today, so why do we keep referring to it as the sunset? It's not. It's the earth turning and the sun going on the other side of the earth. Well, we have phrases like that we use all the time. We all understand it, and it's not meant to be literal. Just like, I don't know how he did it. I cannot explain this to you, scientifically or otherwise, but we know that at one point in time in Joshua chapter 10 and verse 12, Joshua prayed and the sun stood still. Now, how did that work? And I don't know. I've tried to think that through, and I don't have to make it literal. That's not my issue of how it is literal. I don't know how God could keep the universe stopped for that length of time without squirreling stuff up on the other side. I mean, all of a sudden, if you got a long day over here, you got a long night on the other side. So their alarm clocks and the roosters didn't go off because the sun didn't come up for a period of time. Well, were they seeing as much darkness on that side as actually it's on the other side? Because this all happened in the Palestine area, so we would be the ones. Our point on the earth would almost be on the other side, so we'd come closer to being at sunrise or sunset for an extended period of time. I don't know how he did it. I just know he did. They had daylight on that side at that point in time for that period of time, because the rest of the world notice it or have anything to do with it. I don't know. but I know that it happened. And so when it's written about, though, it's written that God made the sun stand still. Well, why didn't the writer explain that? Why didn't he say, look, he didn't really make it stand still. What he did was, and then fill in the blank how he did it. Primarily didn't do all that because the people reading it at that time would have had no clue in the world what he was talking about. They didn't even know the earth was round, much less did they know that it rotated and that it did this and revolved around the sun. All the things that we know now, they had no idea. So as a result, it wouldn't have done any good for the writer to put a scientific explanation in there to explain what God was doing, how God did it, because the people here reading it would not have had a clue what was being read to them. So to that extent, figurative language is a way of expressing oneself in a format that the people around you will understand. And that's part of why God probably, now I'm saying probably because, as I said, the honest answer is we don't know, simply because God did not tell us. But there are figures of speech that we're familiar with in the writings in the Old Testament, the prophets, and in Revelation. For one is a simile. Now, I know Linda Appleton is on Zoom right now, and I always get nervous when she's in my classes because of her English background and my lack of English background. But I try to make sure that, so I always count on her sitting and nodding this way and saying, yes, you got it right. So hopefully she's nodding her head even as we speak. All right, so you have a simile. That's one word that describes the way we use words. And that's like saying he slept like a dog. Or, for example, Jesus' sweat was like great drops of blood. Now, there is a discussion as to whether or not there were actually great drops of blood that fell from Jesus' forehead, and they've medically shown how it's possible to be under enough stress that blood actually would come out of your body combined with the sweat. But you don't have to really prove that point, whether it's true or not. I'll take their medical word for it, but at the same time, that's not necessary because he didn't say that it was drops of blood. He said it was like great drops of blood. So, and the way blood coagulates, the way it falls, is different from the way that water falls. So it could be just a simile and nothing more, trying to express the anguish that Jesus was going under at the time. And the other one that is most famous is the metaphor. And the metaphor is when you say, I am the door. Jesus said, I am the door, but did he literally mean he was a door? Of course not. And by the way, premillennialists wouldn't disagree with that. They don't say that everything in the Bible has to be literal. They say the prophecies have to be literal. So they make a distinction. And if you said, well, wait a minute, do you really think Jesus was a door or the bread of life or any of the other things? And they would go, no, we understand that's figurative, and they're happy to let that go by as figurative, but it's only when you get to the prophecies that they draw the line and say, this is where it has to be interpreted literally. So, therefore, figurative speech is used to describe both punishment and reward. For example, when the prophet says that Israel is going into punishment in captivity, he uses the idea of them going into Egypt. Egypt represents, in the prophets, Egypt represents captivity. Why would that be true? Because that was a turning point in Jewish history. I mean, it's something every Jew was well schooled in, was the time of the going down into Egypt and being captured and kept there for 400 years, and then finally God releases them through the acts of, by doing miracles through Moses, and they come out of captivity and go into the promised land. But throughout history, if you say Egyptian bondage, there's virtually not a Jew that wouldn't have understood that and known exactly what he was talking about. He's talking about punishment. He doesn't mean that Egypt is actually going to come up and recapture them or anything like that. It's just an understanding that that's what Egypt meant to them, and Egyptian bondage meant to them. But it was a big enough thing that it wasn't something that would be misunderstood or overlooked, or there'd be people in the back of the room scratching their head going, what Egyptian bondage? Why Egypt? Why? No, they would immediately know exactly what he's referring to. Now, to show the complete and horrifying judgment of Edom, Isaiah compares it to what? Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, we talked last week about how everything's on fire and it's smoldering and it's constantly on fire. The only thing that could survive was two animals, and why the pelican and the porcupine were picked, I don't know. I don't know how they would survive. But he said that would be the complete inhabitants of the land. There would be a smoldering cauldron of burning things forever. And obviously, that's not true, literally. But it does give the idea of complete, absolute devastation, which never could, in fact, come back. As long as your land's on fire, you will not be able to plant crops, build houses, or come back. Now, literal, no. Figurative, yes. Figuratively, he's saying if you're going to be put under, never to come back. And by the way, he will not say that. He will not use those kind of figures, figurative speech. Any prophet, God speaking through the prophets, will not use that kind of figurative speech when he talks about, for example, Egypt. Why? Well, because Egypt was not put under, not to come back. It did come back. It did come back with the same power, with the same cloud. It has never regained that status that it once had, but it did come back. But a lot of the other countries like Edom, for example, there is no Edom. I mean, you can't find a country, a kingdom of Edom now or even back then. Once it was gone, Assyria was put under, and it never came back. I mean, there are a number, which some of these we will talk about in some detail when we get there. But they won't come back. They didn't come back, and so he uses very graphic speech, not because it's literal, but because they will think back to Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what it's intended for, because it's talking about fire, brimstone, all the words that fit with Sodom and Gomorrah, and they know, the Jews of that day knew that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, never to have it come back. And therefore, when those kind of words and figures are used, they know exactly what he's got in mind, and that it's judgment. Now, to show the redeeming power of the Messiah, when the Messiah comes back, Assyria will be destroyed. He will conquer Assyria. Well, Jesus never conquered Assyria. In fact, by the time Jesus gets back, Assyria is not even around to conquer. So why would you put those two ideas together? Because at the time of the writing, Assyria was the number one enemy of Israel. No one could withstand Assyria at that particular point in time. They were the dominant kingdom. So he says, if I can take out the dominant kingdom, don't worry about any of the rest of it. You know, anything, you take the worst problem that a nation can face. That's tempting, but I'll skip it. You take the worst problem a nation can face, and God says, I'll take it out. It won't be there. I will remove it. Well, as a nation, then I'd say, I don't have much to worry about on a physical level, because if you can take that nation out without giving me any, without me even really doing anything, then I'm not too concerned about all the little nations around that might come up and do something. Because you've shown you can take out the number one enemy of the country. Excuse me. Well, the fact of the matter is that while we don't deal in nations now, we deal in spiritual warfare as Christians. So as Christians, we look at it and we say, okay, what is the worst problem that ever faced mankind? And that was death. There's no escape. There's no getting around it. When you're dead all over. At least that was the understanding. And if you look at the Old Testament, you see the only discussion that is made of any life after death is in Sheol. David will say that he'll see his son, but he doesn't mean he'll see him in heaven, nor does he even intimate that. He doesn't know heaven. He only knows the place of the dead. So everybody died, everybody went to the place of the dead. Your worry, your concern on this earth at that time, under the old law, was not salvation from hell. For you did not know that existed. What you did want, though, is for your name to always be remembered in a positive way. And if you read the book of, in the book of Job, for example, Job makes a request. And he says, I know that my vindicator lives, and that he will come back someday and vindicate me. In other words, I can't explain what's going on, but I know I'm not guilty. Now, his three friends had made him the bad guy. They told him, the reason you're going through this is because you messed up. And he's going, but I didn't mess up. I couldn't. Now, he didn't say he was sinless. He said I didn't mess up because he's offering the sacrifices. He's doing everything he knows to do to please God. So, what's left? What else could I do? Job would say. Why would this be happening to me? Because I didn't do anything wrong. Well, of course, we know what was going on behind the veil as a, if you will, a contest or a battle between God and Satan, and Job was the battleground. But Job didn't know that. So he says, I know. Now, one version will use the word vindicator, and another version uses the word redeemer. For that particular verse. And of course, that's where we get the song, I know that my Redeemer lives. Okay. borrowed from Job, actually, and Job is not talking, in Job, it's not in the context of Jesus. Job's not talking about Jesus. Job's not talking about Redeemer from sin, because all he knows is a sacrificial system that he's already being obedient to the best of his ability. When we see it, we think of it as Redeemer, as in Christ redeemed us on the cross. But that's not what Job was thinking. The psalm, by the way, is about Christ. And I have no problem with that, but I'm just pointing out that it's been moved from its original meaning into the Christian New Covenant meaning with that particular psalm. But point being that the only thing you wanted was for your name to be vindicated, and that you would be remembered as a faithful child of God. If in fact you were a faithful Jewish believing person. So you didn't have the high goal, you didn't know to have the high goal of heaven or eternal life with God, those kinds of things. What you did want, though, is for your name to always be remembered in a positive way. And at the time Job makes that statement, he's having a hard time imagining how he's going to be remembered in a positive way when everything is going wrong and his friends are telling him it's his fault because of his life. But we understand that after he gets everything back and is rewarded by God for his faithfulness, he is now remembered, obviously, by us even today in a positive way. And he was redeemed, he was vindicated. God proved that it wasn't his fault in terms of anything he had physically or spiritually done wrong. It was simply that God held him up as the example of how he wanted men to live in that particular time and place. All right, so you got the idea of vindication coming to Israel in victory. In other words, one day I will redeem my people. When did he redeem them? Well, he brought them out of Babylonian captivity, and he redeemed them at that point to live in their own land, to worship again in the temple and so forth. And they would have, I suppose some of them would have stopped there and gone, well, that worked out well, and we're pleased. But God's got a further meaning behind it. It's not a double application. We're going to, please make note of double application. That is a phrase that is used by the premillennialists a lot when they get stuck on certain things and can't figure out any other way to do it. They'll use the idea of double application. We'll talk about it, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is not double application. This is a further understanding of the original application, because the original application is God will redeem the people, and therefore they'll be brought out of bondage as they were in Egypt. They'll be brought out of bondage from Babylonia, and spiritually speaking, we're brought out of bondage today through the blood of Christ. So it has a long, from almost beginning to end, meaning behind it, but it's far more than just a simple double application. All right. Another reason that God would use, might be using figurative language, is that abstract ideas are much easier understood if you give them some kind of physical meaning that we can get our arms around and hang on to. For example, in Genesis chapter 40, you got a picture here of Judah. The tribe of Judah is being discussed, and God promises that the vines will be so numerous, the grapevines, that is. Okay, now remember, this is one of the major products and major things that you looked at for wealth and success was palm trees and grapevines. These were the rich people. These were the prominent people. These were the successful people. All right, he says in chapter 40, beginning in verse 9 and following, he says that the vines will be so numerous that they'll be used as hitching posts. How does he mean that? I mean, do you really think they tied a mule to a grapevine and expected the mule to stay there? No, that's not what he's meaning. He's saying, you see how many hitching posts there are in this country? Well, that's how many, how your grapevines are going to be. They're just going to be overwhelmingly successful. You're going to be successful because you're my people. And he also says in that same passage that wine, the juice of the grape, will be used in place of water. Now, does that mean that people took baths in wine? No, not at all. But what it does mean is that the wine is going to be so plentiful. Grapes are going to be so plentiful. Success is going to be so great. Wealth is going to be so great that it will be, you can use wine, which there was precious commodity. There'll be so much of it, you can just take a bath in it. Okay. Now, literally, that's not what he's after at all. He's just expressing the idea of how much, how wealthy and how successful he is going to make these people because of their obedience to him. When Solomon's wealth is discussed later on, it is discussed in terms of the silver will be so great, and so silver will be so plentiful, it will replace stones. Okay? That's how much, instead of seeing a rock, it'll just be a chunk of silver. And sort of remind, if you want to put it in an American context, the gold in California was so great, supposedly, that it was just lying around on the ground. Oh, you didn't have to dig far, work far, you just went over and picked it up. That was the stories that came back from California to the east, and that's what got people to go west. Young man go west was because the gold was just falling out of the sky over there. Well, obviously it wasn't, but it does give you the idea of how plentiful this was, that you didn't have to deal with digging, working, or anything like that. Just walk along and pick up gold nuggets. Well, here was silver. Solomon's wealth was so great that everything had turned to silver, and that anything he wanted or anything that he had a metallic value to it far greater than it really was. All dishes, all pottery, everything was not made out of silver and gold. Well, it never was. Now he did go extravagantly wealthy in a lot of things that Solomon did, but everything wasn't that way. And it didn't also mean necessarily that the trickle-down theory worked so that all the people had the wealth that Solomon had. In fact, they didn't have the wealth. They were taxed heavily. They'll be taxed even heavier after he's gone, but that's part of how he was able to acquire all of the wealth that Solomon had. John says in the end of the Gospel of John that if everything was written that Jesus did, the books wouldn't hold it. Now, is that true? No, it's not true. It's not literal. Why? Well, because I could have written down every word that Jesus said if I'd had ink to do it and pens and paper. And yeah, it would have made a bigger book by a lot. but not to the degree that the earth wouldn't hold it, or there wasn't enough ink, or there wasn't enough paper. What is he saying though? John's saying, look, I've given you enough stuff here to cause you to believe in Jesus Christ. Anything I would have added to it would have been redundant. You know, if you don't believe this miracle, showing you 12 more miracles isn't going to make you a believer. Because you either believe one or you know, maybe you need more than one, just in case you might think that was a fluke accident, you know. But once you got several of them lined up here, and here's Jesus teaching, John gave enough information about what Jesus said that God believed, and which means it was true, that God knew that was enough. That would cover the subject. And more words would not help. If you didn't believe Jesus with this many words, 10 million more wouldn't make any difference. You still wouldn't believe. And so you have sermons in Matthew. You have statements in John. You have historical accounts in Luke of the various things that he did and said. Luke records the most parables of any of the four writers. But he didn't record every parable that Jesus spoke. He didn't claim to. He didn't say, this is everything he had to say on this subject. But he wrote down enough that we have it today to read, study, and obey as the case may be. So when John says the earth wouldn't hold the book, well, yes, it would. But just like anybody today, we have the ability today to record, if you so choose to, literally every word that an individual might say. Some people think the government's doing that to us anyway, but you can transcribe all that. You're going to get a lot of worthless material when you do. Who it is, because we're not constantly saying wise and wonderful things here in Washington, Austin, or anywhere else. But you could do it. And when you got it all done, you would have a massive amount of material. But would it be so massive that the earth wouldn't hold it? No. The earth would hold it. So we're not talking literal here at all. We're using a figurative speech to say that Jesus did a whole lot more, and there's a lot more proof out there among people who actually heard him speak at the time John wrote that, than he wrote down. But these things are written that you what? You might believe. In other words, John says there's a lot more out there. But I wrote down enough here for you to become a believer if you so choose. And more words, more examples, more days of Jesus' life would not make it any more sellable than it is with what John wrote. So that's an introduction to and some of the points of why God used figurative language. And next week we'll have some more to say about this. We didn't get it all covered, but that will give you an idea of the direction we're going to establish that God, in fact, did use figurative speech, and that it makes logical sense that he did, as did many of the other writers of other books, and be they spiritual books or books of the Bible or even our own fictional writers. It's just a way of speaking, and God chose to use the way people talked at that particular day and time to express the future events that are going to take place with by the prophets in terms of what's going to take place without making it all literal. So I thank you for being here, and for the Zoom people, I'm glad you were able to be here, and hopefully next week we'll be able to carry on and go further. Thank you.